And
Right.
and just to make it extra hard, let me add on to this. There's a question from the audience. Sheila from Jacksonville, Florida asks, is there a disconnect of supernatural to natural in Western thought? And if so, is this why the biblical context is hard to grasp?
Hmm.
Um, so I don't know. I don't know. You can pick and choose
Yeah, sure.
which
No,
parts of that you want to address. Yeah.
okay. Yeah, well, we can. Let me just actually let me tackle the supernatural to natural question first, because I have a text in front of me, so I can always go back and remember what you wanted, Shia. Um,
Sure.
as to the supernatural and natural thing, of course, in a post Enlightenment Western world, we're constantly militating against what we hear about as supernatural or metaphysical, and the physical world that we can see observationally. And of course, there was a revolution of observational science, but it hasn't been that long that this revolution has taken hold. Um, and so, yes, on the one hand, as modern readers, you need to get back into the driver's seat of the ancient world, as it were, in order to iron out some of those tensions. But as we've already said so far, I mean, Pinchas made this a good point about the burning bush. This idea that, okay, so this is a physical thing. Bush and fire are both terrestrial and physical, and yet there's divinity in it. And depending on the sentence you're reading, first it says the Malach Hashem, the angel of the Lord, spoke to Moses out of the fire. And then the very next sentence says, and the Lord, Yud He Vav He, spoke to Moses out of the fire. So there's even this kind of blurry borderline, even in the divine world. And unless we start to get comfortable with massaging the rigidity of these lines that essentially are just constructed in the modern period, unless we start to get comfortable with making those lines a little bit softer, it's going to be very difficult for us to understand the ancient literature. Um, but again, this goes all the way back to just the mindset of the people who wrote Israel's scriptures, and that is their minds are much more expansive than ours are. They're not, if you will, intellectually straitjacketed by the Greek philosophers. I mean, God, of course, as we read several times over, the God of Israel is enthroned in heaven, and the glory of the Lord fills the earth. Well, that's true, but God also meets with Moses in the tent of meeting and talks to Moses as a friend talks to a friend face to face. This is an idea that the rabbis would later describe as something called tzimtzum, which means contraction. The idea that God is able to fill the entire universe and yet contract God's self at the same time. Now, does that mean God's not in heaven anymore? No. It just means that God is contracted in this tent on earth at the same time.
It's
So
both
again,
and, right?
exactly, both and. Pinchas, that's absolutely right. 99.9% of the time when we come to something that we find questionable, right, in the biblical text, whether it's theological, whether it's textual, whether it's, ideological, it's usually going to be the answer is both and, not either or.
Hmm.
Either or is something that has been constructed for us, but it's just not the same construction that the ancient writers are thinking of. So um, definitely a difference between natural and supernatural that we need to massage that a little bit more. As it goes to what Saul of Tarsus is saying here in Acts
Nick,
17. Yeah, go
Nick,
ahead.
can I just interrupt you for a
Sure.
shameless plug? Because if people are interested in learning more about Tzimtzum and some of these other aspects that we've talked about, I've actually done a course at Israel Bible Center, an introduction to Jewish interpretation. So they might find that interesting.
Yes,
So I end
absolutely.
my shameless plug here. Please tell
No, I
us
love it.
about
It's a
That's
good
Saul of
plug.
perfect.
It's a
Tarsus.
good
That's
plug.
a
It's a good
great
course.
plug, and it was very, very natural as well. That was very nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, so no, absolutely. I think that Jewish interpretation, both before and after the New Testament, is very, very important. And I think a course on that is, I think that listeners and viewers would really get a lot out of some of the things that we're saying, some of the basic foundations we're laying down here, if they could dive more deeply with you into those questions. Now, on to Saul's point here, why use these poets, these Greek poets? Well, in the first place, the audience would know who they are. This audience doesn't necessarily know, well, perhaps knows, but perhaps doesn't. The God of Israel is not a deity that is populating these people's brains on a daily basis. And we
No.
think in terms of capital God, God. Like, there's one God in the universe, and anybody who's worshiping anywhere in their own ritual or their own way is really worshiping that one God. Well, that is not the view of the ancient people that are around Paul. So that is, they'll go through their whole lives maybe not even knowing who this deity is, the God of Israel. And for Paul, though, this is the supreme deity over the whole world, the creator of heaven and earth. So Paul uses the poets, the Greek poets, as a way in to discuss. But notice what Paul's doing. If you actually go into the context of this material in this Greek poetry, so it says, "For in him we live and move and exist." That's Epimenides. Or, "For we are also his children." Who's the his there? It, in the original context, it's not the God of Israel. It's Zeus.
Mm-hmm.
It's the supreme deity of the Greek people. And so what does Paul do? Paul essentially Israelifies the Greek material, slots in what the audience would know is supposed to be talking about Zeus. And Saul has the chutzpah to spin that around and say, no, yeah, you think it's talking about Zeus, but it's really talking about this deity who you may have never heard of. But guess what? This is the creator of the heavens and the earth. So
People, I have to interject. I have to interject because this, what Nicholas is saying, is just reminding me of a wonderful scene in my favorite movie. You guessed it, The Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yeah.
What? So Jack Sparrow breaks out of the prison. If you haven't watched it, shame on you, go get it. It's really, really something. So
Shame
Will,
on you if you
that's
heard
right.
that from the dean and
So
founder of Israel Bible
Will,
Center.
right.
Shame on you if you haven't
Yeah.
watched Pirates of the Caribbean.
so this guy Will breaks out Jack Sparrow out of a prison. Will has his own goals, and Jack Sparrows just want to get out of the prison, right? So, and they're trying to get to a particular ship, but they have to go unnoticed. So they grab this boat, flip it around essentially. It's flipped around boat, upside down, and they get underneath of it, and they hold it really, really tight, and they begin to walk by the sand under the water like this. And of course, while they're holding it like this, their heads like this are over their heads are catching the air that got caught in the boat, right? And so at this point, Will Turner says to Jack, "This is either madness or brilliance." Jack Sparrow answers, "It's remarkable how often those two traits coincide."
Yes, indeed.
So,
Yeah.
I'm almost wondering what's in the world going on here with the Zeus and with Paul. And first of all, the fact that something doesn't really have a connection never stopped other Jews before from making their point.
Yes.
I hate to say this to you, but if anything, this may show this. Look, Paul has a point to make, and he's going to make it no matter what. And look, he also needs to connect somehow. And what is a better way to connect? Just to say, listen, I'm one of you guys, but let me tell you something else. So Nick, I don't know if I probably took it to a different thing, a different direction, but it's almost like I want to bring in a little bit of a more earthly type of Paul that has problems that you and I have. And sometimes we don't necessarily have connections, but we're making our point when we gotta make our point, because the point sometimes is even more important.
Yeah, I think that's
whether or not they're legitimate.
Yeah, I think that's good, Ellie. Yeah, no, I think that's right. Notice one thing that Paul doesn't do, and this is actually, this is a page that we can take out of when we're talking about, even interactions with people who don't necessarily hold the same worldview as we do, right? Notice that what Paul doesn't do here. Paul doesn't start with, all you people who worship Zeus and Aphrodite and Athena and Hera and all these gods, you're all morons, okay? It's very clear, and it'd be obvious to you if you just used a brain cell once in a while, that my God, the God of Israel, the Jewish God, is the supreme God over the whole world. I really don't have a ton of time for you people, and I think you're pretty dense, and I wish I weren't here even giving this information to you. And if you don't get on board with me, you're going to hell or something, right? That is absolutely not what Paul does here, okay? What Paul does is that he starts with, and Shia noted, it starts with, I know how religious you all are. It's very obvious to me. He's looking around at all the religious iconography, which he's probably not too happy with, because Jews aren't supposed to make, images of their God. But that's not. He spearheads with, look, I know that you're religious and that you're pious in your own way, and I'm even going to cite material that in order for me to meet you halfway and get you into a terrestrial discussion, a mature discussion. Well, I think this is something that everybody, regardless of what your worldview is, that everybody can take a page from in Paul's approach.